Good morning. What's going to happen to the economy of British Columbia in 1984? 1983 was a near disaster. Now, the mood of the economy, confidence or lack of it, is often reflected in this particular madhouse. To you and me, anyway, the Vancouver Stock Exchange. Today, I'm going to interview 8 of the leading figures in British Columbia on their prognostications about a number of vital aspects of British Columbia 84. Will there be labour peace? Will social credit foul it up by bringing in tough anti-labour right-to-work laws? How will the lumber industry perform? How will pulp and paper perform? Is there any future for the mining industry? And what about you as consumers? Mortgage rates. Will your friendly banker be really friendly this year? Will consumer loans be easy to get for that sports car you've always wanted? That and many other aspects. But first, where did this mess all start? And I'll be back with 8 explanations after the break.
I think we've been very lucky to get out of this period as we have.
1983 was a very bad year for political and labour unrest in British Columbia. How did we get in such a mess? Let's put that question. I'm not talking about 1983. I'm looking back to the more prosperous years of the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. How did we, with all our clever bankers and prognosticators, get in such a mess? I'm going to put that question to David Sinclair, senior partner in Coopers Lybrand, the big worldwide accounting firm. Mr. Sinclair, with all these smart aleck people we have in the top of our banks and our economic councils, how did we get in such a mess in Canada?
Well, I think, Jack, you got to go back to the early 70s when we had the oil crisis, and that really was the start of it. And the economy just simply got overheated. And then starting in sort of late 81 or early 82, at least as far as British Columbia is concerned, it was a little earlier in eastern Canada, it was like going along at 100 miles an hour and we hit a brick wall. And I guess in all sort of economic life there are waves and patterns, there are waves and flows. And we just simply got ourselves into a mess. And we're paying the price, or have paid the price for that over the last 2 years.
Would you say that the 1983 crisis is basically over? Or, as one economist predicted to me today, do you feel that we might be in a stable trough of the lower end of capitalist success for the next 20 years?
Well, I don't think it'll be the lower end of the trough, but I think we've been very lucky to get out of this period as we have without facing a really major depression. What we had to have is the kind of medicine that we've had to take over the last 2 years to bring us back to our senses.
By we, who do you mean by we?
This means all of us. The tough part about it is that that burden falls very unevenly on the different segments of society. But I don't think anyone, bankers, economists, government, can really sort of see their way out of it. We've got the medicine to take. I think we've had to take it. It's been forced on us. And what I see, looking ahead over certainly the next 2 or 3 years, which is about as far as you can look, is perhaps a period of more stable, steady growth. I think there's some very positive signs. I think interest rates look as if they may be fairly stable. I think that the international trade picture is looking a little brighter, particularly for Canada, and particularly since the U.S. is about 70% of our market, which as far as British Columbia is concerned is of course very, very important. That consumer economy in the U.S. seems to be taking off. That means that we're going to sell more lumber and get better prices for it, sell more pulp, sell more newsprint. So what I see for the next 2 or 3 years, provided we're sensible, and there's no guarantee that collectively we're going to be sensible, but for the next 2 or 3 years, perhaps a period of some stability. It's not going to be great. Unemployment is still going to be high. Business has taken such a shellacking. A lot of it, its own fault. It's own fault. Nobody sort of anticipated this, but it happened. and business has had to react. It's cut down on its payrolls. It's been looking at its costs. It's, I think, going to come out of this leaner and tougher.
You talked about a depression, change it to recession. Were you thinking by any chance of the possibility of an international collapse? When people, laymen like myself, look at these, there might be scare stories, there might be not. I don't know, Brazil, Mexico, and all these other countries who owe billions to the big Western banks. Is that still a possibility?
Well, it's always a possibility, but I think we're over the worst of it, Jack. And as I said a moment ago, I think we've been very lucky to get through it quite as well as we have. Very lucky indeed.
Now, do you think here we are in Canada with comparative prosperity even to this day. Can we afford, with the present policies of any federal or provincial government, to support this kind of, what do they call it in a fancy way, safety net for people?
Well, if you look back at it, Jack, what happened is really up until about the mid-70s, governments in Canada were pretty responsible. The budgets perhaps might not have been exactly balanced, but they weren't bad. And starting about the mid-70s is when this thing got out of hand. And part of that was simply inflation. And as you get inflation, governments make more money. They benefit from inflation. And they had the money to spend, and we've added to the whole panoply of government services. We now run into a situation such as we've encountered over the last 2 years, and we can no longer quite afford that level. That adjustment process is going to be painful, and it's going to be difficult. And the hope, of course, is that our economy is going to grow, and we're going to be able to at least sustain the sort of the basic level of these services.
Of these safety nets.
Of these safety nets. If you look at something like unemployment insurance, it's going to be in a large deficit this year, but the contributions are going to have to go up. Business is going to have to pay more. Those who've got jobs are going to have to pay more. I don't disagree with that as a fundamental philosophy.
I'd forgotten that particular lesson, that when interest rates were at 17, 18, 19, 20%, this was a great boom to the government and probably the cause of gross overspending by everyone.
I don't think there's any doubt about that, and I think business was just as guilty of that as government. Money was easily obtainable. You could go to your banker if you sort of saw a deal and you thought, well, I better take it now because it's going to be more expensive next year.
That's right.
And you looked at all the people who were into the borrowed money game, making money, or at least making money in paper. Real estate was the prime example of that. A lot of it was pure speculation. There was no real substance behind it.
You make very good sense, and say business has learned its lesson. But if business and government learns this classic classic lesson, that means more and more people are going to be out of work, because lean and mean means more unemployed, doesn't it?
Well, what we got to do is get back to some sort of sense of sanity. And if you go back, you and I, Jack, are a few years between us, but not many. You go back to the 50s and 60s, if we made 2% more or 3% more a year in terms of our take-home pay, we weren't that uncomfortable or that unhappy with it. Now, we've had a situation, certainly in the late 70s and through to about 82, when if you didn't get 15% or if you didn't get 20%, then you were losing out in the
Do you think people are prepared to accept this kind of modest, no-change situation, watching the standard of living, in fact, going down from a cottage, a boat, and a car, just to a cottage, a cottage, a boat, and a house, and a car, just to two of these items? Are they going to be happy with it?
I think that's getting through, and certainly in the last 6 months, if you look at the general pattern of wage settlements, it shows some reason, it shows some order. And we know on a broad sort of basis that an economy is going to grow somewhere in the region of 2 to 5%. And if we don't have, if we have wage increases exceeding these levels, the inevitable must happen, we have inflation.
One last short question. Bankruptcies, therefore, of inefficient businesses are good for the economy?
Well, I happen to believe that what economics is about is the sort of allocation of scarce resources. And what bankruptcies are, although they're tough and they're tough on people, is that's the flushing mechanism in our free enterprise system.
Well, would you say there's not much that much between us, but for a man of your advanced years, you're quite hopeful for the next 10.
I'm hopeful. I've got great confidence in what I call the innovation and the hard work and the sort of the basic strength of the Canadian economy.
Regardless of the politicians.
Regardless of the politicians. I think we're a smart people.
David Sinclair, Coopers Lybrand. I'll be back after the break.
Very often, the interests of workers are not served by majoritarian unions.
A man who is regarded as one of the architects of the 1983 crisis is Michael Walker of the Fraser Institute. Michael, I know you don't want to take any credit or blame for what happened in BC in 1983, or do you?
I'll take all the credit where the credit is due, and I don't want to take any of the blame.
None
just
of the
like
blame.
yourself.
I want you, however, to spell out to me what amendments you think the social credit government should do to the Labour Code to ensure industrial peace in British Columbia in 1984.
Wow. I think that our interest, Jack, is not to be with industrial peace, but rather with survivability. And the question really is, what kinds of modifications do we have to make to not only to the legislative environment, but to our thinking about the economic environment in which we live, to best prepare us for the competitive reality that we now face in international markets. We now know, let's take a look at what some of the realities are, Jack. One of the reasons why we didn't have the recovery that I expected in 1983 was because our pulp and paper products are not selling in the United Kingdom or in the European marketplace. One of the reasons why they're not is because we've suffered a competitive devaluation relative to, or appreciation relative to Europe. Well, what are we going to do about that? We have to face the fact that the cost structures that are now built into our production of those products are not survivable in the long term. So, so what are we going to do about that? I mean, in some sense, the only appropriate answer to that question is I don't know what we're going to do about it. I can suggest some things that would help.
Will you suggest, and I'll put this bluntly to you, because this is perfect for survivability if you can keep the peons peaceful, would you suggest right-to-work legislation, which would break the stranglehold of the trade unions, for instance, in the close shop, hiring hall provisions, and all the building trades in British Columbia?
What I suggest there, Jack, is that what we've got to do is we've got to protect the interests of individual employees in the province. And what we've seen over the course of the last 2 years, not only in British Columbia but elsewhere, is that very often the interests of workers are not served by majoritarian unions.
I mean,
and in fact,
majoritarian, you mean democratic?
No. I'm specifically not saying democratic. We had an instance in the Downey Street sawmill, which you well know, Jack, where in fact the majority of workers didn't get an opportunity to vote.
That was a very complicated, I will not endorse your blank statement like that, but you wanted, let me put it simply again, do you wish it to be easier for the reduced number of employees in a unit after layoffs to decertify their union?
It should be easier for unions to decertify, yeah. The code that's written in British Columbia, by the admission of those who designed it, was designed really to make it very easy for people to certify and make it very tough for people to decertify. Well, in the environment in which that code was designed, Jack, where we were really concerned about just carving up a pie that was getting bigger every day, that was probably, you know, we could excuse people for having that attitude. But that's not the problem we have now. The problem we have now is how are we in the construction industry, Jack, to cope with the fact that most of the unions and most of the union wage rates in this province are simply not competitive.
But is that problem not solving itself in many ways, in that non-union firms are appearing and bidding and getting jobs?
Well, sure. And who are staffing those? It's the union members who are staffing them.
Yes, sir. But what about
that's an attitudinal change, Jack. That's one of the things that has to happen.
What about the places where the labor force is protected by a common site agreement? You would like to see common site agreements broken.
Well, because it's not protecting. We look at, Jack, we look at those things and we say it's protecting people. We forget about the people that it's disadvantaging. And the people it's disadvantaging is those people who are told the wages are too high, you can't have a job. And I think we've got to look more to the people who are excluded rather than the people who are included in these agreements. And that goes for closed shop and other kinds of exclusionary contracts.
What goes for closed shop? What goes?
Wait a second. One of the things that people don't recognize is that most of these agreements are not due to legislation. Most of the closed shop provisions in this province arose as a result
of private agreements.
Private agreements.
Like
And private
SETI.
agreements privately arrived at, as far as I'm concerned, are no concern of governments, except to the extent where they have third-party effects, where they are in effect an exclusionary arrangement, a monopoly arrangement which shouldn't be allowed to exist.
Yeah, well, like the 10-year no-strike contract on the peace and the Columbia. That's perhaps before your time, which was signed between the government and the unions.
I don't know anything about that.
But you see, you should be more specific for me, too, because you were quoted as saying in the Canadian press from Edmonton on November the 16th, 1983. Lovely quote. I got to stuff it down your throat. Politicians are basically chicken. They want the path to be well lit and trimmed out by people who have gone before them. And Bennett, to some extent, has opened the path. Politicians are chicken, aren't they?
Sure.
I mean,
They're followers.
minimum wage really is nonsense.
Minimum wage doesn't protect the people that it's said to protect, Jack. I wouldn't say it's nonsense. It's a provision that many people believe very strongly in, but it's something which has diametrically opposite effects. The Economic Council of Canada a few years ago in a study of minimum wages showed that it was an important cause of unemployment amongst youths, amongst young people who, when you were going out into the workforce, and you probably did, Jack, you worked for below the minimum wage to learn something about how to work.
But I had three jobs.
Wait a
I had
second,
three
that's
jobs.
all right, but you worked for a long period of time at a low wage and made an investment in your skills.
Simple
And that's
question,
what- that's
Michael.
what
I want still to have time to ask you for your predictions. But are wages too high in British Columbia?
Yes, they're too high for the future.
Can the market forces bring down those wages without major industrial disruption?
They can, given a compliant legislative environment. Unfortunately, the environment that we have now, I think, inhibits it to a considerable extent. Because one of the things that has to happen, Jack, is that, in my opinion anyway, is that we have to have fewer of the workers in British Columbia represented by the agreements which currently exist and the attitudes which currently exist, which were struck during earlier times.
What you want is a compliant legislative environment. Have you anything specific you want the government to do?
Well, we've already mentioned one, that it should be easier for
Decertification.
for employees to change the conditions under which they work. As say, it should be easier for decertification.
Would this not merely mean higher profits for employers? You know perfectly well that the free enterprise businesses, how much will the traffic bear?
Well, that's certainly not a consideration at the moment, Jeff, because none of the major industries are making very much in the way of profits. In fact, none of them will show any clear profit for about 4 years to get their balance sheets back in the position, and that is not a very stable position on which to lay the groundwork.
Do you feel kind of responsible that you were one of the forces which teetered us on the brink of a general strike, which might have ruined us for 5 years?
No, I don't think that I was one of the forces that put us there at all.
Give me your predictions, therefore, for British Columbia, particularly in various resources, raw materials, for 1984.
Well, let me first say, Jack, that the future is kind of a collective noun for ignorance and uncertainty. And we have to bear that in mind when we try and do predictions. You know, I made some predictions here a year ago or so that turned out to be too rosy. And they turned out to be too rosy because of, for reasons that we simply couldn't foretell, developments in the United States, the fact that our European markets didn't recover in the way that we thought. The things that seem to be fairly generally accepted now is going to happen during 1984. And I won't go any farther than that, is to say that we have good prospects in pulp and paper, good prospects in dimension timber, because the European market, which is at this moment 14% below even the 1982 level, should come back. There are specific areas in minerals that look encouraging. Zinc looks encouraging. Molybdenum looks encouraging. Copper, unfortunately, I have to be continuingly a bit pessimistic about. The consensus of forecasters is that British Columbia will lead the country in growth next year, all these things being considered. In goods production, we'll lead the country, so that we'll get about 4%.
Unemployment
growth.
will stay double digit.
Unemployment will decline, but will, because of labor force growth, will stay in the double-digit level. Yeah.
Because of your high profile, I must finish with a yes or no answer. Has Bennett been chicken?
Been chicken? Certainly, he's been anything but chicken.
My thanks to Michael Walker. I'll be back after the break.
For those without jobs, the situation's dismal.
Did you know that there is a left-wing alternative to the Fraser Institute? It's called the Pacific Group for Policy Alternatives. And in that group is David Schreck, who runs CU&C and is associated with, a number of NDPers and whatnot.
General assorted left-wingers, Jack.
And you found it necessary to form this organization to counteract the honest, direct Tory views of that well-established and well-respected Fraser Institute?
Well, we were feeling that the Fraser Institute was very successful as a propaganda agency, and in order to be fair to the news media so they knew where to go to get alternative speakers, we thought we'd make ourselves visible.
So you therefore are an alternative left-wing propaganda body for the media?
We aren't saying there's anything wrong with representing one's biases. It's just nice to declare them, not try to misrepresent them as fact.
As a PhD in economics, give me, without any bias, if you possibly can, a 20-year prediction for the state of North American or Canadian economy.
Well, I think things are going to be pretty stable at about the level they are now. Certainly for the foreseeable future, we will have double-digit unemployment, probably reasonably modest inflation, 4 or 5% range. Interest rates will remain high in real terms, and that will help to keep us in a stable trough, a depressed state. For those that have jobs, we aren't going to go through the types of anxiety we have in 1981 and 1982, nor is there going to be any great temptation for runaway inflation, because the unemployed people are right around the corner looking at every person's job and wanting to take it. For those without jobs, the situation's dismal. I mean, the jobs just aren't there to be had, and there's a real danger that that could erupt into more social problems, more marriage breakdown, more crime, more violence.
Well, let me take you back a little step. You're now telling me that, in your considered opinion, 20 years in a stable but highly depressed trough, correct?
That's right.
Those with jobs will be lucky,
yes,
and secure. Those without jobs will not have much of a prospect of getting jobs.
Well, the only way to get a job for those without jobs is to be faster and beat out the other person. But that's not a matter of any more jobs being created. That's just a matter of trying to scramble to the top of the heap. But the heap's going to remain the same.
And at the end of this line, you see, you didn't use the phrase trouble in the streets, but you say much more crime, much more marriage breakdown. In other words, you're saying the free enterprise system is going through its classic collapse cycle.
Oh, it's been that way for hundreds of years and continues that way. Not a collapse cycle, though, Jack. It's a stable portion of the cycle. If it was a collapse cycle, we'd expect it to go up and down, repeat the type of thing we experienced in late 81 and 82. And what I'm saying is it's not going to fluctuate that much. It's just going to be stable at a less than full employment level.
And less than full employment, you say double digits. So in the next few years, you never see any less than 10, 11, or 12% unemployment.
And you can imagine what that does, to kids coming out of school. If the first 5, 6 years of their experience when they should be working is sitting around on the dole or not getting out of the house, that will affect them the rest of their lives. This
is one of the vagaries of the labor movement, which always worries me, because the whole thing is hinged on the fact of last hired, first fired. So whenever a union wins a battle on layoff or job seniority, it's the kids that suffer.
Well, you have to ask yourself, as troublesome as that is, would you prefer to see a person in his 50s who are supporting those kids who are at home and trying to pay off what's left of a mortgage, toss that guy out of a job and destroy his life?
All right.
I mean, somebody's going to hurt one way or the other.
Okay, David Schreck, your prognostications are a little bit fearsome. Can we therefore afford the present support services for those who are semi-permanently unemployed? Can we afford UIC, which is now, what, 200 and some a week if you're on the maximum? Can we afford dental plans? Can we afford health care on the present scale?
I think we can't afford not to have those programs, because if you look at a future that's going to, for as long as we can predict, maintain at least 1 out of every 10 people unemployed, apart from humanitarian purposes, just to protect you and me, I don't want those people breaking into my house or mugging me when I walk down the street. And the facts are, if we don't look after those people, they're going to look after themselves, as you and I would do if we were in that situation long enough.
So therefore, those underprivileged people are going to go to a lower standard of living as the tax revenues don't support increases.
That's right.
Answer me this question, and you're in the health business. Is there any reason, would you recommend that the medical profession or the dental profession be placed as civil servants, and people who go through all wage agreements are, under the aegis of EdPEC and the Compensation Stabilization Board?
I wish it were that simple. The problem is that the situation of the dentist and the physicians are radically different. And the reason I say I wish it were that simple is they work on a piece rate basis where in many respects, once they have an established practice, they can write their own paycheck. The dentist of British Columbia, and I can announce it now for the first time, it's not public news yet, but they've put out a new fee schedule effective February 1st next month, in which they've unilaterally given themselves a pay raise of 3.8%. I've costed it out, and it's really just over 4%. They claim it's 3.8. You and I can't do that. We can't say, well, here it is, Mr. Insurance Company. I'm giving myself this increase, and to hell with you. I'm not going to negotiate with anybody. That's what the dentists are doing. And PEC or anyone else is stymied to try to control that sort of thing. One, there's not the legislative background.
3.8, how much will this take out of the economy?
Well, I know out of CU&C Health Services alone, it will take almost $3 million. The impact on the economy will be it will push more private health and welfare plans into further reducing their benefits, and it puts us one step further to the situation where those people without private dental insurance simply can't afford to go to the dentist. I mean, it costs you $50, $60, $70 for a checkup and having your teeth cleaned if there's nothing wrong with you.
Why does it always...
And these 10% of the population, these people who are unemployed, they can't afford that kind of health care.
Is there no control on the dentists?
None at all. Now, that's why I say they're different than the physicians. The physicians, while there are problems with piecework, and I'd like to see some alternatives to it, at least they sit down with the government and negotiate their fee increases. But
when they don't get an increase, they merely increase the utilization.
That's right, and that's a problem.
As a left-wing economist, would you think that the doctors' basis of salary should either be changed or at least capped?
Well, as a left-wing economist, I think the only way to solve the problem is with more competition. Because you see, Jack, I want Medicare to work.
How can you have competition in doctors?
You compete for patients. And what you do is you create some salaried health centers. I've just set one up, put $500,000 into it, CU&C did. And we have a physician working on salary, and we're recruiting another one that we're going to start in a couple of months. And when you have some working on salary, you know where your costs are there, you can fix it and you control it. And then you look at how many people they can service and compare it with what you're paying out on the piece rate system. Then when you sit down and negotiate, really you play the two groups off against each other, but it gives you an element of control, and you get that control through competition. Ontario's gone that way. Ontario went that way 5 or 10 years ago.
To sum up with you, two things. One, 20 years of a stable trough.
That's right.
20 years of the poor getting poorer.
Right.
And maybe 20 years or a couple of years of the dentists getting richer.
Well, and people losing access to services like that where the government hasn't provided the safety net.
My thanks to David Schreck of the, don't forget the name of this group, the Pacific Group for Policy Alternatives. I'll be back after the break.
If you take on a major segment of the population, the economy suffers from it.
Regardless of world conditions, regardless of interest rates or inflation, the key to the economy in British Columbia in 1984 may well all center around the labor situation. With me now is Art Kube, the BC Federation of Labour, the man who with his colleagues in the Federation and in Solidarity fought a very tough battle and partly won it against the social credit policies of 1983 continuing to 1984. Mr. Kube, do you honestly see any chance of labour peace with the present government and an upsurge in the economy with the present attitude of the government in Victoria?
Well, we don't know yet. As you know, there was a partial agreement reached with the government. We're going to see how they're going to act upon that. If they lay off the attack against organized labor and a great number of minority groups, we can have a very good year, Jack. I mean, the lesson I think the government has learned last year is that if you take on a major segment of the population, the economy suffers from it. We saw a tremendous downturn in consumer spending. If we want to have a good year here this year, there's going to be a number of components to making it a good year. One of them is consumer confidence. The other one is an increase in the lumber markets. And the third component, a decrease in interest rates. If these three things happen and the government doesn't try to take us on again, we can have a fairly good year.
But let's look at 1983 for just a moment. You sound quite bland and quite confident, but you are still facing the big hurdle of what's going to happen to the amendments to the Labour Code in 1984. And you know as well as I do, Mr. Kube, that if there was the slightest threat of right-to-work legislation, would you not threaten a general strike?
Well, I think that if right-to-work legislation comes in, then I think that we can kiss any sort of economic recovery goodbye.
What is right-to-work legislation, though? Are you agreeable, prior to the study, that there are certain things that can be tightened up for the benefit of business in the present Labour Code and all the other allied acts in the hands of social credit?
Well, I wouldn't want to preempt it. There's a committee which is going to be established. I put forward 6 names. It's up to the government to pick 2 of those. They're very competent people. 4 of them are former vice chairman of the Labour Relations Board. If the government can point out where they had a problem with the code, by all means, there can, it should be looked at. Naturally, we're not completely happy with the code either. We would like to make some recommendations for change, especially dealing with arbitration and so on and so forth.
But you feel quite confident that there's a new atmosphere of calmness on the part of social credit because you could put again 50,000 people on the streets if you were faced with unsettling or threatening legislation?
Well, if there's unsettling labor legislation introduced by the government, I would suggest to you that the things which happened last year were indeed small potatoes, and because it would be a total confrontation.
Yes. Now, the unemployment state in British Columbia at the moment is some appalling 13-point-something%. Is that not correct?
That's right.
So that weakens your position in Labour itself because all your per capita is down, unions, even big unions, are laying off their own office staff. What do you see is going to perk up the economy for 1984 if there is a stable political climate?
Well, I think an economy in this province has to be in the first instance led by consumer spending. There's enough in savings in this province that we could finance the first phase of an economic recovery. We have approximately $30 billion in personal savings. Naturally, housing starts in the United States would stimulate the BC economy, and there are a couple hopeful signs. The family formation is an all-time high in the United States, approximately 900,000 family formation per year.
What do you mean family formation? People getting married?
Yeah, household formation.
Consumer spending?
That's right. And they will require additional housing. As you know, housing starts been down. There's a certain backlog build up. If interest rates in the United States drop by 1.5% to 2%, I think housing starts in the United States will jump to approximately 1.9 million units. And that should really bring back the BC lumber industry.
So therefore, apart from the $30 billion in consumer spending, which a happy trade unionist might take out of the bank and spend,
that's right.
You're still telling me there was still a tail of the dog in primary products.
Well, no question you cannot sustain a recovery solely on consumer spending, but it could finance the first phase of it because, Jack, even if housing starts going up in the United States sometimes in late March, April, and May, there's a little bit of a backlog, so we wouldn't see the real effect by it till most likely May here.
Right. It was a zero wage increase year, 1983, by and large, was it not?
Yes.
What will Labour require to keep happy in 1984, not forgetting that Mr. Bennett has got the all-powerful Mr. Peck of the Consumer Stabilisation Board standing there? Is Labour willing to be reasonable in 1984 on its wage demands when we have such horrendous unemployment?
Well, organised workers in this province have made a decision to reduce their standard of living. CU increases reduce their standard of living by about 4.5%. I don't see any major shifts in that particular policy for 1984.
You mean to say the workers are prepared to reduce the standard of living another 6%? Another 4%?
No, I'm not saying that, Jack. I'm basically saying that between the mid-1983 and mid-1984, wage increases were very largely zero in the large bargain units. Wage increases in 1984 will be running around 4%, 4.25%.
Does this not shock you yourself when you look back at the halcyon years of only 2-3 years ago?
Well, look, I think that wage increases are a reflection on a marketplace. The only thing which has to be taken into consideration that when you look at an economic business cycle, usually profits are the first ones to go up, wages tend to lag, and at the end of the economic business cycle, you still get a fairly decent wage increase, whereas profits start to lag. And that's the history of economic cycles.
Are there any other irritations on the social credit horizon which would cause, apart from rough amendments to the Labour Code? For instance, the human rights thing, you're quite happy now that that will not become a major issue in 19, or even the rentalsman would not become a major issue enough to upset what might be a stable climate for the coming year.
Well, look, the rentalman's issue could be a serious problem, just like interest rates are periodically a serious problem. Because if you see rent increases going up considerably, then you have to remember half of our members are renters. And if their rents go up, there's going to be pressure on a bargain table. Because, you know, collective bargaining, if people like it or not, is really a true reflection of kitchen economics. What does the worker need to make a living?
In one sentence, therefore, if Bennett minds his P's and Q's, you'll give him a chance for all of us to have a good year.
I think that you summed it up fairly clearly.
I'll be back after the break.
We're not looking to hammer anyone. We just want a fair deal for everyone, including business.
Nobody can forget that during 1983, the province of British Columbia teetered, teetered is the right word, on the edge of a general strike. But due to some fairly cool heads and crises, we seem to have got through it. But where does Jim Matkin, President of the Employers' Council of British Columbia, stand early in 1984? When you look at 1983, Mr. Matkin, another year like that, any more labour crises on that basis, and the last one to leave BC will put out the lights.
One of the great things about mankind is we learn from our experiences, Jack. And I think that all parties have learned something from the experience of 1983. I'm hopeful that 1984 will be a much calmer year. I think that in terms of the issue of dissent in a democratic society, we can look forward perhaps in 1984 to the regular legislative processes as embodying the points of view of the majority through the government and the minority through the opposition.
Well said in a truly moderate manner. I've just had a well-known economist regarded the right wing in here telling me that that there must be a compliant legislative climate for employers, easier decertification of unions, perhaps a hard look at closed shops and other things. What amendments to the Labour Code are you advising, as you will do, the Consultative Committee to make?
We're advising fair changes that respect the reality that we are living in a tough economic climate. We're not asking for a special favor for the employers. We're not looking for a compliant legislative period. We're looking for fair legislative treatment of the employer and employee interests. Change has been the hallmark of all progress. I think the Labor Code has been subject to a lot of change. This should be remembered. And we look forward to 1984 to the extent that the Consultative Committee works as bringing about some needed change.
But labor management piece must surely, regardless of the world recovery or not, must be the basic key to the stability of BC in any market. Is that not correct?
Labor management cooperation is an important factor in our economic future. Productivity is an important factor. How we achieve those two things, productivity and labor management cooperation, that will contribute to our stability. And
Which, surely when you look at our building trades or our common sites or our very high wage levels in relation to neighboring provinces, surely we automatically, putting this to you provocatively, price ourselves out of the market both in productivity and sales.
well,
Do we?
I think you have to look at each case. Let's take the construction industry. I think the construction industry are the major bargaining situation for 1984. I think we're going to need to have some facts about cost comparisons. This is the year for a tough economic assessment. And I think we've seen in the forest industry settlement a 3-year contract for the first time in the history of the industry. No increase in the first year. Now that's a pattern, Jack, that I think will be followed in the construction industry.
I forget the IWA settlement. 0, 4, and 4, was it?
0, 4, and 4.5.
0, 4, and 4.5. So 83 was a 0 year.
That's right.
And that's a 3-year contract for the IWA. Does that mean, though, that non-productive people should get the same kind of thing, like office workers, for instance? Should they be getting 4 and 4?
Well, each industry has to be taken on its merits. Some industries may have to take less than 4 in order to be productive, in order to be internationally competitive.
Are you not hopeful of the signs, this is perhaps unfair, of the growth of non-union firms? Is that healthy in construction especially? Is that a necessary health aid for British Columbia?
Competition is healthy for British Columbia. One of the things that we have seen is that the non-union firms represent a form of competition. I don't think that we will see a major shift in the makeup of trade unionism in British Columbia. I think the trade unions will respond to the competition and maintain their competitive position.
Do you think we've really, speaking now from the other angle of the Economic Council, you have a lot of members who are in small business. Is that still disastrous? Reasonably sized business. In 1983, they had a bad year.
1983 was the year of the 3 R's, restraint, recovery, and red ink. We're trying to come out of those 3 R's in 1984. And I think there is every sign of hope in the economic future of 1984. The U.S. economy is showing a great deal of strength, and we are very dependent upon that economy.
Does it really, though? I mean, people keep throwing at me 1.7 million housing starts. It doesn't seem to reflect in employment. We've got 25% of the sawmill and 16% of the coast and 16% of the interior out of work in our basic industry.
One of the problems, Jack, is illustrated by that fact that the forest industry is now serving smaller homes, 1.7 million homes that have a smaller square footage than the homes in the past. The mining industry are servicing smaller automobiles, and as a result, we're finding that the supply of our natural resources is not in as much demand. Also, we find our other foreign markets in Japan and Europe have not had the strength of the U.S. market.
Yeah, well, things like Northeast Coal, said he depressingly, eventually bankrupt us?
I don't think so. I'm not an economic guru, but certainly the Japanese experience is to go in for the long term. And I think that they're looking to balance the stability of their supply over a long period of time, and they're doing that with the opportunities like the Northeast Coal.
Well, basically, we're through 83, and are you quite confident that we shall have, I'm not so confident as you are, that we shall have peace in 84?
Well, first of all, we're going to have fewer agreements, so we've got less bargaining points.
But the IWA out the way, we should have pulp out of the way by then. Civil servants are out of the way for how long?
The civil servants are out until 1985.
1985.
That's right. And we really have half the number of agreements that we had outstanding in 1983. We only got 25% of the unionized agreements up for negotiation. So that's a positive fact. We've got the construction industry, but the competition of the non-union forces there will be a mollifying influence.
Can I judge from the tenor of your opening remarks, in answer to my question, that the Employers' Council of British Columbia will be a moderating influence to those undoubted forces on the right wing of British Columbia who really want to hammer Labour with a tough Labour code? You know it as well as I do.
The business community, Jack, recognizes that we've got to work together, that the human resources of this province are an important potential for our economic future. We're not looking to hammer anyone. We just want a fair deal for everyone, including business.
My thanks to James Matkin, President of the Employers' Council of British Columbia, and I'll be back after the break.
We expect in 1984 to see some restoration of volume and some restoration of price.
It's a fact of life we can't forget. Prosperity in British Columbia flies or crashes on lumber, pulp, and newsprint. And today I have with me Ray Smith, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Macmillan Bloedel. When was the last year you sat back in your big tower, which you used to own, and rub your hands and say, that was a good year?
That would be about 1979, Jack. And 80 wasn't all that bad either. And then 81, in fact, 2 months after I became president, the world fell apart.
That was your luck.
That was, well, I don't know if I contributed to that or not.
But the fact remained was that in 1983, you might break even, or would you have a big deficit in Macmillan Bloedel?
We have a chance of making a marginal profit in 1983.
1983. Well, very bluntly, let's take it one at a time. Pulp. How does it look for us? I remember you crying the blues, you and Mr. Knudsen, crying the blues about the competition from Northern Europe on pulp when they devalued the kroner or something. How are you doing now on pulp?
Well, the pulp market is gradually recovering and probably will do as well as any product line in '84 because we don't have overcapacity in that line. We expect in 1984 to see some restoration of volume and some restoration of price.
Can we compete? I mean, I remember complaints from Macmillan Bloedel particularly because of the heavy taxation in British Columbia, who were so many dollars a ton dearer in our output than the province of Quebec, for instance.
And that's still the case. We're still more expensive in our costs than most of our other competitors. But the fact of the matter is, when the market is working and the economy is driving paper production and pulp is required, then we do participate in it. It simply means that in poor markets, we probably get out earlier than others and are a little later getting back in.
Your pulp employment, generally speaking, in the industry, is it still quite good? Because overall, not talking about Macmillan Bloedel alone, 25% unemployed on the coast and 16% unemployed on the interior, generally speaking, your industry. How is Macmillan and Bloedel doing in relation to its normal, quote, full employment?
In the company as a whole or in pulp only?
Your choice. Company as a whole.
Company as a whole, we're probably right on the average. 1983, I think our company as a whole, and it's difficult to estimate sawmill capacities and operating rates, but generally speaking, about the 75% level. And I think that would reflect the 25% unemployment that you mentioned for the coast.
Far be it from me to nag such a distinguished expert as yourself, but that was a dreadful year when you gave them 15 and 13, wasn't it? Gave them 15 and 13.
They negotiated it, and we gave it to them.
And you were wrong.
We were dead wrong.
And you won't do it again.
We're going to try our level best to avoid it.
And the contract you made this year with the IWA particularly is a fairly modest contract, is it not?
Yes, it is. I think it fairly reflects the problem that we both have in facing the next 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, now you've got a 3-year contract with the IWA.
Yes, we do.
So therefore, you're virtually guaranteed reasonable stability in the entire industry, including Macmillan Bloedel, as far as the labor climate is concerned.
That's right, Jack, and that was really the basis for the 3-year contract as we were discussing with the IWA for about 6 or 7 months, and they negotiated hard. We didn't get everything that we were looking for, nor did they, of course. I think it was a very reasonable agreement that we've come to now. They're still voting on it, of course.
Yeah, and still. Are you fearful at all? This is a kind of pseudo-political question. Are you fearful that the government of Victoria might be unwise enough to bring in very tough amendments to the Labour Code, causing any kind of explosion in the year ahead? Would you counsel the government of Victoria to use moderation on the amendments to the Labour Code?
Well, I'm not sure what they have in their draft. I believe they're up to
40 or something.
40 or something of that nature. And without really knowing what they have in that draft, it would be hard to decide which is tough and which is easy. However, I think the thing that we all have to keep in mind is that we speak with a very loud voice in British Columbia, and anything that would tend to cause instability is something we'd have to think through very carefully.
Like the panic we went through last year on the, what did you call that thing in Washington, D.C.? The countervailing duties?
Countervailing duties.
Was that a phony panic or a real panic?
That was a real panic.
I wondered, you know, now and again whether or not it was just a bit of a phony.
No, well, we've had, you know, over the past 25 or 30 years, there were 2 or 3 other attempts on the same basis by the American producers to
now that that's been settled, the fact that we are apparently, quote, to summarize, not subsidized by governments, are we home free on that? Or do we face that threat again in the near future at all?
I think we have to keep it in our mind at all times, Jack, because there are still elements in the United States who believe, despite the ruling, that Canadian lumber is unfairly taking a part of their market.
Right now. What about efficiency in Macmillan Bloedel? You took, oh, first of all, you trimmed much of your middle management, didn't you?
Yes.
Quite brutally.
Yes, we did.
1,200?
We know the number was closer to 1,500.
Managed to place some of them elsewhere, I presume.
In fact, we're very pleased with the placement rate of the entire lot that we...
But you have, your company has been accused over the years of not modernizing its plants. Can you tell me now that because of the lack of renovative capital due to the depressed state of the market, that you will not be modernizing any of your plants in the year ahead?
No, to the contrary, Jack, and I think to go back to your first comment, no company can modernize every plant simultaneously each and every year, but the record of investment by Macmillan Bloedel in its plants is extremely high. In the pulp and paper and in the wood products, which we were caught mid-stride with the recent depression or recession, we had completed the $54 million Alberni Pacific, another $25 million into the Alberni Plywoods, and we were in the process of commencing yet another old mill renovation when, of course, we got caught with...
That wasn't Cowichan, was it?
Chemainus.
Oh, Chemainus, I mean.
Yes, yeah.
But no more on that now.
No, we're still reviewing the plans for what we're going to do with our sawmill capacity. We might have something to say about that within a month or two.
Are our good mills as good as the best in the world?
No.
Oh. Why not?
Well,
Who's got the best in the world? The Swedes?
No, there are mills in the U.S., there are mills in Scandinavia, and of course there are, when I say generally speaking, our mills in the BC coast are not up to snuff. I'm excluding some of those mills in the interior, which are really first-class mills.
One final thing. Quoting Ray Smith from a recent speech, BC is now further down the road to becoming a more marginal supplier of forest products to the world. If the slide isn't halted, the whole BC economy will falter. Do you want to amend or modify that for 1984?
No, I think we face that for the rest of the 80s and probably the 90s, Jack. We have a big job to do. It's one that we can do. But we are facing the plantation economies of the world, not alone the U.S. South, but South Africa, New Zealand, even the UK, and many others in the world where fiber is not short. I think, and you may have read from the same speech, a quote from the Forest Industry Advisory Committee, that there is no shortage of cellulose fiber, and the world will find a way to use it if the price is right.
My thanks to Ray Smith, Chief Executive Officer and President of a firm we call irreverently, but with a certain amount of emotion, Mac Bloedel. I'll be back after the break.
I think 1984 is going to be a spotty year, quite frankly. I think it's going to be a difficult year.
I often wonder if in any way, shape or form the stock market, especially Vancouver stock market, reflects truly or gives an indication of the state of the economy, where we're going, or if it's merely the old gambling speculation on which some people seem to make millions and everybody else loses their shirt. A most unfair way to introduce the chairman of a stock exchange which has been improving its image year by year by year. Tony Hepburn, president of Odlum Brown, and chairman of the Vancouver Stock Exchange. First of all, Mr. Hepburn, what kind of year did you have in the Vancouver stock market in 1983?
It wasn't a bad year in many ways. It was an active year, Jack, but certainly so far as our index was concerned, it wasn't an up year, but it certainly was very active, and the exchange had a good year in terms of its own performance.
Remember, you invented a new index last year, didn't you?
Well, not really. We started the index January of '81, and we ran into a few problems with it, so we had to correct these errors, but it was not a new index, the same index, now giving an accurate reading.
What is the accurate reading of the index now?
Well, the accurate reading of the index is that it wasn't down anything like as badly as was earlier as the earlier index was showing. But it's still, as a resource exchange, knowing how low resource prices are right now, gold, lead, zinc, silver, copper, you name it, our index, of course, is down from its highs, unlike other markets that are really at all-time highs.
They're the industrial markets, you might say.
That's right.
So, therefore, what do you predict for 1984 in the terms of the performance of our resource stocks? And you must be interested in our lumber and pulp stocks, too, in the Vancouver market.
Of course we are.
What do you predict, Mr. Hepburn?
I think 1984 is going to be a spotty year, quite frankly. I think it's going to be a difficult year. I think that disinflationary forces are still very strong. I think resource prices are going to have a hard time of it this year once again, unfortunately. I don't think the cycle is turning as it normally does. Normally at this stage of the economic cycle, we'd have had soaring commodity prices. That is simply not happening. And there are expectations that oil prices may be cut. Gold prices, of course, as we all know, are lower than they were a year ago, quite a bit lower, and expected by many to go still lower.
Now, but every now and again I see these huge extravagant stories in the Vancouver Sun about stocks, like I think I can name one, I don't play the market that much, Hemlo, for instance.
Yes.
Is this a resource developed from Vancouver in Ontario?
Yes, it is, and it's a very important gold find. But you see, gold, even at present prices, is very economic to mine. The Hemlo discoveries are rich discoveries, and even if gold drops a little more than right now, the Hemlo area will still be a very attractive area to invest. Gold is priced in US dollars, for one thing.
But you're talking about investing in Ontario.
Yes.
Aren't you?
Yes, in this particular case, but there's lots of gold exploration going on in British Columbia also.
Would you recommend that, what kind of investors do you have by and large? Are you mostly small people or large people in the Vancouver Stock Exchange?
Oh, a lot of small and large, but I would think the typical investor in the Vancouver Stock Exchange is your average investor. He doesn't necessarily have huge portfolios. He's a speculator.
All right, where does he go in 1984? Where does he go? What does he do? He's sitting there and he's thinking, my God almighty, the only safe thing really for my money is Canada or US Treasury bonds or term deposits. Is that the wise thing for the cautious person to do still?
For the cautious person, undoubtedly, yields on very high-quality investment instruments, such as you mentioned, treasuries and savings bonds, this type of vehicle, are extremely high right now. So the cautious investor undoubtedly would go for that type of investment. The Vancouver Stock Exchange, we must remember, is a venture capital market. It's not for the cautious investor. It's for the person who's prepared to take high risk and risk his dollars, because the risk of loss is very high.
You mean a venture capital market? But only that because, of course, we're basically hewers of wood and drawers of water in this province. Is that correct?
Well, that's part of it, I suppose, but the Vancouver Stock Exchange has developed a very meaningful market in terms of venture capital, not just for British Columbia resource exploration, but for resource exploration around the world. We've really built up a very fine reputation. So capital is raised in Vancouver for worldwide exploration.
Yeah, you said spotty, though. When you say the market's going to be spotty, you're not looking at British Columbia as such. You're looking at the investment market in the entire North American scene.
Yes, I am. Absolutely, yes.
If you're looking at British Columbia, is there any hope whatsoever of a resurgence in a larger scale development in our basic resources, for instance, natural gas?
In 1984, I would say not. I would think the odds are strongly against it. I think if we look beyond 84, there's reason for some optimism, but it's cautious optimism right now. So much depends on what happens in the United States.
Oil, what about oil?
Oil, there's expectations that oil will be cut in price. Now, that's not all bad news, because quite frankly, $3 or $4 off the price of oil, Canadian oil producers finders of new oil can still make a very good profit.
Well, what about the old standbys with which we used to live, copper, zinc, molybdenum, etc., etc., etc.? They're off the board.
They are indeed, and I don't think they're going to have a meaningful recovery until the world economy as such really picks up. And the key to that is certainly lower interest rates, first in the United States, and that means lower deficits, in the United States, and as we know in Canada too, but primarily the United States, that's where your big problem is, and lower oil prices too. Europe, after all, pays for its oil in US dollars. The US dollar's been soaring to all-time records against the UK pound and all the rest of it. So Europeans are actually paying more for their oil, not less, as we are here.
And in fact, the Canadian dollar, even though we don't think it's worth a nickel, is strong, is it not?
It is strong against currencies other than the US dollar, yes. It has been extremely strong against the pound and against other European currencies.
Strange, isn't it? But the big mines, or any new mining developments in British Columbia apart from coal, is a no-no. Is that correct?
Well, absolutely, and I don't think a new coal mine is about to open up other than those that are already in the development stage, because coal is certainly not in high demand around the world right now.
So therefore, there's no point in me nagging you, Tony, about the labour climate in British Columbia. Just the general national climate is what you're concerned with.
Oh, very definitely. Yes.
But in the United States, surely investors, surely any good Canadian who wants to speculate a little bit must go to the United States.
Yes, I believe the United States is a very attractive place to invest for Canadian investors. But so is Canada too.
But not BC.
BC right now, because of the unattractiveness of resources, certainly is less attractive than sometimes. But there will be pockets of strength, and certainly new discoveries, if they occur, will certainly still produce good results for investors.
So therefore, your traders will make an average living next year, but there'll be no great big money for them.
That would be my guess, Jack, yes.
Yeah. What did you think of 1983?
Well, 1983, of course, for the provincial economy was some spotty recovery, but it was certainly no great shakes, nothing to what was happening in the United States. For our business, quite frankly, it was a good year because there's a lot of expectation that recovery will be sustained in 84 and that we're on a good path. So,
well, what indicates recovery? People keep talking about housing starts, but I mean, there seems to be a total world depression in almost everything, is there not? Newsprint. Would you invest in British Columbia lumber shares except for the purposes of the occasional attractive tax shelter?
well, that certainly has been one attractive way of investing in lumber shares. A lot depends on U.S. housing starts, and certainly they were very good in '83. So lumber didn't have a bad year at all, and lumber producers in this province certainly were producing a lot of lumber and making good money at it. Their problem was, of course, pulp, and newsprint wasn't so hot either. But I think it so much depends on what happens worldwide insofar as these industries are concerned.
Toss of the coin, index up or down at the end of '84?
The Vancouver index?
Yes. I
would say a little bit on the downside.
My thanks to Tony Hepburn. I'll be back after the break.
Our projections are for the first 3 or 4 months of '84, it's going to be pretty tough sledding again.
One of the slogans of the biggest bank in the country, it is the biggest bank, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
Is can do. And with me now is Les Edmonds, who is the Vice President for British Columbia of retail banking throughout this entire and glorious province. Can do in 1984?
Darn right, Jack.
No kidding?
No kidding.
Aren't you part of the system, however, which encouraged to a gross and dangerous extent retail spending when inflation was at its highest?
Well, the people of BC, they're not stupid. They realized last year with the high interest rates and the economy and maybe their jobs wouldn't be there the next month, they stopped spending and they paid off their debt by using their savings accounts. So our overall consumer debt in 1983 in the province of British Columbia certainly dropped off.
Well, let's look at can do for 1984. Can I whip in there if I'm a young guy with a job which I've held 6 months and borrow money for a sports car?
I think if you have the ability to repay it, yes.
In other words, it's the credit for those who are employed at a reasonable state will be quite easy, you think, in 1984?
Yes, surely it is, providing you can repay it and you have the necessary ability, both in security and job, and yes.
Providing you've got enough money not to need to borrow it.
No, not quite that. But you need an equity. You need an equity.
You need an equity in something or other.
Certainly do.
Now, what about, I want a mortgage for my house in 1984. What are the mortgage prospects and for what lengths for my young couple? Only one of us working, going to buy a house in 1984.
Well, providing you qualify, there's a lot of money around. As you know, mortgage rates right now are, in fact, the one-year term is the same as the prime rate, which normally doesn't happen. In other words, you're getting a fixed rate loan for the same rate as the large corporations in Canada borrow their money for right now.
What is that right as of now?
11%. 11%.
11%
Yes.
is prime.
Yes, that's the
And
prime.
get a 1-year mortgage for 11%.
Right.
That's the lowest since how long ago?
3 or 4 years, Jack.
And that'll be amortized over 25 or 30
Yes,
years.
yes.
And if I have a longer term of mortgage, does the interest rate go up
Yes,
or
it
down?
does. It goes up.
Now, why is that?
Well, because what you're doing, you're getting a fixed rate mortgage for a longer period of time. So I guess the bank or the financial institution that's lending you the mortgage is taking a risk that interest rates will go up or may go up. And therefore, you're protected for that term of that mortgage.
So the bank is protecting its bet, and I might say 12.5 or 13% over a 2 or 3 year period. But of course, why don't we have floating rate mortgages?
We do. We do have floating rate mortgages.
In other words, if I take out a 3-year mortgage in a house and interest rates plummet, will you drop your rate in my mortgage?
If it was a fixed rate mortgage, no. But you could prepay it by 10% a year, or you could pay it out within a prescribed time with a penalty.
Remember all that problem we had with a number of banks? I'm not accusing the Royal Bank about this at all, whereby people were told over the counter there'll be no penalty to pay back, but when they came to pay it back, it wasn't in the document. Remember that problem? Did that
Yes,
hit you?
there was a problem. Yeah, we had a problem. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending which way you looked at it, if our lending officers made that commitment, verbally or written, we honored the commitment. That was in 1982.
Okay, so 1984. Now, I'm a small businessman. Banks, generally speaking, have been accused of being very tough on the small businessman and calling notes and debentures like nobody's business when interest rates were high. What will your philosophy generally be for 1984? Are you going to help the struggling businessman, or do you put his back against the wall and say, pay up?
If we can, if at all possible, we certainly will help him. It depends on how, what state his business is in. If he's too far gone, if he's not viable, if he isn't able to make it, then of course it's best for him and everyone else that we have a look at consultant or something.
Do you think 1984 will be a good year for someone to go into a business with some reasonable expectation of making money?
Our projections are for the first 3 or 4 months of 84, it's going to be pretty tough sledding again. But come spring, we think maybe the economy is going to turn around, and as it does turn around in the States and Canada, that there will be an improvement for the small business.
So mortgages are prime for 1 year at 11%. What about loans, personal loans? Or do you prefer us just to use our maximum on our Visa instead of taking a loan from the bank?
You know better than that, Jack.
No, that's a legitimate
Well, of course, interest rates on Visa are 18.3% at the Royal Bank. You can go in and get a personal loan on a floating rate at around anywhere from 12 to 13, and you can go into and get a personal loan with a fixed rate from anywhere from 13 to 14.5. So certainly, if a person's going to buy something, they buy it by way of a personal loan.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yes.
So that for people who buy long-term on a credit card, paying 18 or so percent, are really not being very clever if they can afford to take the loan and pay it off at a much lesser interest rate.
Depending on the amount of the loan. But
Yeah,
yes, that's right.
If it's, say, $500 or up, or $600.
Well, $500 or $600 isn't really that much difference, but when you're talking in the thousands, it makes a difference.
Makes a big difference.
It surely
indeed.
does.
Now, 1983 was it a really bad year? I mean, not. By the way, do you publish? I do believe under the new Bank Act, you've got to publish the amount of loans you've written off, don't you?
Yes, it's carried in our annual statement. The averaging effect, yes.
And a lot of businessmen must have gone to the wall in 1983.
In BC, both personal lenders and businessmen had a very tough year, very tough.
If a customer comes to you and wants a good idea about an investment for, say, a couple of $1,000, what's your advice nowadays to the small investor in your bank, the guy with the account in your bank? Where should he put his money in 1984? Is this a year for speculation, or is this a year to buy term deposits?
Well, I think the stock market, if you read what everyone says, the stock market, if you invest wisely, isn't a bad place to put your money. I suppose real estate, they say that the real estate prices are going to improve a little bit in 1980.
Do you really believe that?
Yes, I do.
Is that not just the propaganda of the big real estate
No.
things? Prices are going to surge in 1984.
No, I don't think they're going to surge, but I believe they're going to go up. I'm personally a firm believer that Expo 86 is going to do a lot for the Lower Mainland. Now, maybe not so much in 84, but certainly in 85. I think prices are going to improve. I think housing starts are going to increase. So if you invested wisely, real estate maybe is not that bad of a...
One word, for those who are in trouble, if they come to you if they're in trouble, I'm talking about mortgage holders and that kind of thing, do you deal with them quite generously?
If a person cooperates with the bank and keeps us abreast of what's happening, yes, we do.
So Les Edmonds of the Royal Bank, in one word, 1984, inflation stay about the same?
Inflation between 5 and 6%.
And a good year perhaps, after the spring?
Yes.
My thanks to Mr. Edmonds of the Royal Bank. I'll be back after the break. It's kind of like you pays your money and you takes your choice. The general prognostications are that it's going to be more of the same, with maybe a slow and steady progress, maybe a little spurt in retail buying in the spring. But I'm hopeful, and most of these people are hopeful too, that we shall have industrial stability and labor peace in British Columbia. That's the economy. Your guess is as good as mine. I hope it goes well. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. precisely.